Today's topic is negotiation, and negotiation is a really broad-based category, obviously. But this was a really, really important topic for me to bring to the forefront. And I realized how big of a deal it was when I was actually in my first role and hiring people, because I started to notice the difference between the way that men and women would negotiate. And my first hiring capacity, I was working at a software startup, and I would have, a lot of the hires that we were making were kind of fresh out of school folk. And these young guys would come in and they would be like, I think I'm worth $75,000, and, would kind of come in with their bullet points. And I would be wildly surprised because I was like, you don't even know how to send an email. But when the women would come in, they would just not even negotiate at all. And this gap kind of only continued to appear and continued to appear. And upon reflection, I realized the only reason I knew how to negotiate was when I was starting to go for my first major positions. I had a mentor who was a man and would push me to negotiate and kind of practice with me and things like that. And so now I have actually made it a mission. For those of you who know me, you know that my team is all female. And when they come in, I tell them, here is what I'm offering you. I want you to negotiate with me. And if they don't feel comfortable or know how to, I will actually practice with them in advance of our meeting so that they feel like they can have a discussion with me, because I think it's just a really important skill that we teach and build into other women. And so I make a point now, anytime I hire somebody, that if they don't negotiate, I push them to do it so that we can get more comfortable with it. Okay, so why is this so hard? There's three reasons that I really dial into. The first one being is that there is this inner voice, particularly in women, that I feel like is just hardwired into us, that tells us that we have to be really appeasing and we want to get along with everybody and we don't want to push the envelope and we should just be grateful to be in the room. And this is a voice that we have to recognize comes from culture at large. It's not something that's innately wired into us. And it's not something that men carry around thinking that they've got to get along with everybody. And so it's something that we have to push back on and recognize. And so, for example, anytime that I was in an early situation in my career where this came up, this voice of like, oh, let's just take it. Let's just be happy to be here. I would make a point to step back and say, well, wait a second, who are the other people who are up for this job? How are their skill sets applicable in comparison to my expertise? Am I worth more? And in particular, one of the questions that I learned to ask in relation to salary negotiations that I think is so important is, what is the band that you have in place for this role? Because there is always a range in a salary situation. Companies, may want to be trying to get off to pay somebody more, but it's really, really important to know the range that you're playing in, because if you're going to aim higher, you've got to talk about why. And one of the things that I never knew or in the earlier stages was to ask that question. And so I've taught everybody that I work with, and I started asking it myself, and it allowed me to bump up. And it might not be a huge difference to the company. $10,000 to the company might not be a huge difference to them. But to me, particularly early in my career when I was a single mom, it made a huge difference to make that bump up in my salary. And so it was something I really had to practice and push for. The other thing, though, I think, and I think this is not a gender thing, but I just think it's a cultural thing. And I know some of us in the room are really big fans of developmental psychology, but I think as a society, we are just not really taught productive ways to solve disputes. We've got a pretty conflict-oriented culture, and so there's kind of two options, which are like, we're either going to have this hard-hitting negotiation, or we're going to be totally just like doormats and we're going to roll over and we're not going to have any discussion. And so what I think is really important for us is to kind of reprogram the ways that we think about negotiation, rather than it being a situation of being combative with another person, but instead thinking about, how can this be a discussion? And the other thing that I like to think about is like, what is the milestone we're trying to reach? So if we've got two people who are sitting so far apart, how can we inch our way towards the middle? That doesn't mean that I'm necessarily going to get everything I want and this person's going to get everything they want, but in the end, we can find some common ground that we're comfortable with. And you'll see in some of my examples today, I'm thinking about negotiations in a lot of different situations because I've had a lot of different types of experiences here. So I'll talk about, this isn't just about salaries. And then I think the third one, and this one became so apparent when I was kind of prepping for this session to the point where it kind of made me want to throw up on my computer screen, is that we're just fed this messaging that women are not competent in this area. So even when I was looking for good articles and citations, I was finding just all of these like Harvard Business Review articles and things like that that were like, well, here's all the reasons women are bad at negotiating, and here's how you can get better, ladies. And I was like, you got to be kidding me! Like, it's 2020, really? We think that this is viable? But again, I have looked at the situations that I was brought up in, and it was like, yeah, unless I had people around me who had taught me the skills, I would not have felt confident. But are we putting women in situations where they're building these skills? Then let's not fault us for not having the training and the resources. So I want to flip that paradigm on its head. I think that women can be the best negotiators, because great negotiation, isn't about arguing. It's about discussing. It's about listening. It's about connecting with people. It's about empathy. It's about finding common ground. These are areas where women shine. And one of the paradigm shifts that I loved is from this woman, Erin Gleason Alvarez. I'll share in our Slack channel afterwards. She had a really great piece around mindful negotiation that I just loved. And she's an attorney, but she actually, kind of has focused a lot of her work around teaching women mindful negotiation skills. And she had this quote that was like, if you're a woman, you are negotiating just as you breathe. Like, our ability to move through this world requires constant compromise, requires constant negotiation, whether that's with our partners or with our workplaces or with managing our families, all of these things. And she said, one of the ways that we can reframe our thought processes around negotiation is, instead of thinking about it as this big, massive thing, start to recognize the moments in our everyday lives where we're constantly making these small negotiations, where we're constantly working with our team to discuss, when should the deadline be? How are we going to get things done? And recognizing that we're actually using this skill all the time. So instead of it feeling like something that's out of our reach, we can recognize, oh, wow, I'm negotiating all day, every day. This is a skill I already have. I'm just doing it in a different situation or circumstance. So I wanted to just have a moment for discussion here and ask you all, like, are there 3 everyday situations, or maybe even just one, and you can write them down or you could share out loud, where you are negotiating in your work life? I know for me, I do a lot of the sales activities inside of our company. So I'm constantly negotiating the value of our services with potential clients. But I was curious to hear from a little bit of the group, like, where are the places in your life that you're negotiating all the time?
I'm happy to go first.
Yeah.
So one of the everyday, so I have 3, like you said, 3 examples, but they're all sort of also very different from each other. So hopefully I
Yeah.
can learn a little more by telling you about those
Yeah.
examples. One of the examples is, I have a technician who works for me in a way. She works once a week, um, where I assign experiments or I assign some tasks for her. She's a single mother and she has to drive in from work from really far away. So every week we sort of have this tiny mini negotiation session where, depending on the weather, I mean, we just had a huge nor'easter hit and
Yeah.
go the East Coast. So depending on whether she has to take care of her child, depending on whether it's safe to drive, depending on how early or how late she can come, we always have a nice chat about how much she can do on that particular day and like how much I want done on that
Mhm.
particular day. So I feel like it's a nice negotiation of workload, which sounds a little abstract in my head now that I say it out loud, but I think it's a very useful
Yeah.
negotiation because it depends. Like every week, the conditions are different,
Yeah.
and it's kind of a really interesting thing. I didn't expect to enjoy it, but I actually enjoy it a lot now because I get to know more about her situation and what she's willing to do. And I realized if I gave in a couple, some of the days where she was in a bind and she couldn't like drop her child off in daycare or something like that, and I usually just say, oh, that's fine, you can take the day off. It always comes back to me, and she's always so nice to me, and she always gives me like an extra day. She'd be like, "Oh, last week I didn't work for you. This week I can work for you for 2 days."
Yeah.
So I've never been disappointed with her, but she's just an amazing person. So that's one. Second is sort of more domestic, I guess. I negotiate with my spouse about chores at home, which I think is also a very interesting negotiation. So yesterday he said he was going to make dinner, so I offered to quickly vacuum the living room, and I think that worked out really well. That was a really quick negotiation because he knows I don't like cooking that much, but I love cleaning up, and that worked out really well. And the third one is sort of a little more complicated, but I would love to talk about it. I also make podcasts. So I'm a science communicator and I make podcasts. Um, and so I'm pretty active in that whole field. And one of the things I recently negotiated for was a contract to make a set of 12 podcasts. Um, this is something sort of really new, not just for me, but a lot of the people in my immediate podcasting community, because podcasting or podcast production is still not viewed as sort of like an industry. So
Mhm.
there is no industry standard for what you should be paid,
Yeah.
or what a podcast maker should be paid for their time. And since this is a solo run, I guess not solo, but me and my staff, we run this together. But since we don't really have examples to sort of look to, so it's while negotiating the contract, I couldn't really sort of, throw the question back at the person and say, oh, what do you expect is the range for this?
Mhm.
And so we had to sort of come up with something that we thought was a fair estimate of our time, our effort, and all the things that we use to make the podcast. And
Yeah.
so I think we did a good job. I think we negotiated for $500 an episode. So we're getting paid $6,000 for 12 episodes.
Yeah. Yeah. So I love this last example in particular because each of these requires a back and forth with another human being, right? Each of them
Yep.
has us having to do some comparison, weighing, what are we spending versus what are we getting, or, what are we expecting of that person, and what are we getting in return? And these are great examples of this is something we're doing every single day, right? Does anyone have any other examples they want to share? Because I think this helps us to see like, oh, this is something we're doing all the time. Melanie.
Um, I negotiate with clients quite often, and it's interesting in it maybe doesn't seem like a negotiation, but there's often this back and forth around coming to an understanding around their data and the value that we provide on an ongoing basis. So it's not in negotiating the contracts, but in 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 discussing um, the work that's being done. And I have the perfect example that happened yesterday. So I'm doing a review engagement, and it's for a client, a not for profit. It's their first time having this done. And so I'm trying to explain to them how we have to do the financial statements to adhere to the Canadian GAAP, like the accounting standards. And it's a huge departure from how they've normally done it. So they're saying, well, that's not how we do it. And I'm saying, but this is how you have to do it. And so I have to get them to come over to being happy with how we have to do it, and get them to understand the way it's being done, and also um, try to use the accounting rules in a way that is also beneficial and informative for them.
Mhm.
So there has to be this melding of both the accounting principles um, and how they've currently been doing it. So it's a huge negotiation, and it's often very difficult because the terminology that they use is very different from the accounting terminology. So
Mhm.
it involves, getting to know how they operate, how they talk about like their vernacular around their financials, and then teaching them the wording that is going to be used in the financials.
So what I love about this example, Melanie, is that like this is like a further point as to why I think women are so good at negotiation. Is because you're having an education moment, right? So
Yeah.
like context is everything when we go into a negotiation, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later on. But research can be really important too to understand like where is the gap between where you're at and where I'm at. And so providing that moment of education is a really empathetic thing to do, and ultimately hopefully we'll get the client to understand, this is why, Melanie is so valuable. And it also gives you this awesome opportunity to highlight your expertise in the process. And so like these are all things that I think that like when we think about that traditional paradigm of negotiation, we're not talking about as much. Like how can education be a part of the process? How can ongoing discussion be a part of the process? How does context really change the conversation? This is fantastic. Anyone else want to offer anything before we move on?
Yeah, was thinking kind of the similar as Melanie. First, I was thinking I have 3 kids and I negotiate with them all
All
day
day
long,
long.
right? Especially the 3-year-old.
Mhm.
It's all about the negotiations, little lawyers I have over here. But similar to the accounting industry, we experience this a lot. It is the education piece of, like you guys know, there's a lot of really, really not great accountants out there that, that take advantage of people. And in the same way, there's a lot of really not great creatives and marketing agencies out there who promise the world and can't deliver on it. And so I find myself in the same space of constantly educating. And it's almost that negotiation of like, you have to choose an expert. And so we experience that a lot sometimes with our clients who have us as a creative marketing person, and then they'll have a like another type of business coach or something. Typically it's a man in his 60s and he's white. And some of those conversations can be tricky because we're like, we often come to a point where we're like, okay, well, you just have to choose an expert here. Like, are you going to go with the person who's in this industry or someone else, and so it's that constant push and pull and back and forth of just showing your value, showing the education that you can give them and things. So I feel you on that, Melanie, for sure.
Well, and I think too, and Jamie, have very similar situations for you and I, but it's also this element of hearing people, but not necessarily taking it on. So for example, a very common one that we come up against is somebody wants to like unpack their horror story of a past person they've worked for or with, right? And I know this happens in the accounting space too, but like creating space to hear that, let that conversation happen, say, wow, I'm really sorry, that that's something that you dealt with, but also not allowing that to then define how the negotiation goes. So just because you had, a terrible experience with a past practitioner that took you on a ride and didn't deliver on the services that they said they would, doesn't mean that I'm going to suddenly fluctuate my value based off of your prior experience. In fact, if anything, I probably should be worth more because I'm actually going to deliver on the things that I said. And so that's a really important one to be able to like, how do we create space for people to feel like they can air that out? Because unless they, get it off their chest, they might continue to kind of view you with a level of suspect or things of that nature. But at the same time, also making sure that we're not allowing that to determine the ways that people perceive the work we're going to be doing. So that's a huge one in our space. Yeah. Okay. I love these. Thank you all for sharing. So I want to go ahead and look at just a couple new ideas to share today. And again, I want us to continue also share from our own experiences, but I broke down and really reflected on what were the 5 areas that I think have made the most difference in my ability to negotiate. I did a little research too, just to back some of these ideas up. The number one mindset shift, skill set shift for me has been maintaining a state of mindfulness. And mindfulness is, defined as a non-judgmental state of complete awareness. And what this really can do is move us away from that, again, that combative or competitive mentality. I think that's a really masculine paradigm, and instead focuses on grounding us into the present situation being aware of all the different, behind the scenes things that we have going on. So a lot of times the energy that people bring to a negotiation might not have anything to do with you, might have to do with, again, past experience, differences in knowledge or abilities, frustrations inside their company, budget issues, all these other things that we could take on if we're not standing in the state of mindfulness. And the other thing that practicing the state of mindfulness allows us to do is to approach the situation from a place of positivity, approach it from a place of collaboration, approach it from a place of, how could we work together to find that middle ground? And what it does is it shifts the negotiation from being a obstacle to an opportunity. And so I'll share about a recent negotiation situation I've had going on. And it's a negotiation that has been going on for 5 months now. And it has been a doozy. We have been invited to work with one of the largest accounting firms in the world, and their team's paradigm and legal process and contracts and everything is the most masculine, the most old school, very David and Goliath situation. A lot of butting heads, a lot of, we got, even the language, we just got to push this through. We got to get this over the line. And for the first couple of months, I started to get wrapped up like in this paradigm because it was so all consuming. And it was really affecting my mental health. It was affecting the way that I felt about my company and the work because it was such a big contract. It was just like zapping me of all of my energy. And luckily for me, I have a very good attorney that's involved in these kinds of conversation. And he happens to be a super, super mindful person. And his approach has constantly been, let's just get on a phone call. Let's get to know each other. Let's talk through some of these points of disagreement so that we can understand what you're aiming for and what we're aiming for. And we can see if we can find middle ground here. And so what I really had to do is take a step back from the situation and acknowledge the way that it was affecting my energy. And then the second I took a step back, I could recognize, oh, wow, this paradigm is so interesting. I could be fully mindful. They have a really odd dynamic internally. We have a situation where there's a sitting CEO, but really he's not the person calling the shots. There's a different person inside the organization. So there's a power dynamic that's playing out inside of this negotiation that actually has nothing to do with me. Okay, there's a budget issue. Again, not on me, isn't gonna change the way that I claim my value, but that's a paradigm that's playing out. And so suddenly by stepping back, I allowed for the negotiation to stop zapping all of my energy. But I also started to see from this state of mindfulness all of the other dynamics that were at play inside of the negotiation. And by doing that, it suddenly wasn't about, oh my gosh, these guys are taking so long, they're impacting my business. It wasn't really about me at all because a lot of the roadblocks were coming from their side. And so I was able to shift my energy when I entered into the conversation with them, started it from a place of positivity. So anytime I would get on a call in relation to the negotiation, the first question I would ask is, what are we hoping to achieve today by the end of this call? Grounded in the results that we're aiming for, come with a totally different positive energy. Okay, awesome, great to know that. They would share, how can we make strides forward in these areas? And then we would open up the discussion. And so I started preparing a totally different type of question rather than, where are you at with this? What can we be doing? It was like, how can we continue to open space for you to, again, kind of air all this stuff out that doesn't have anything to do with me, air out your frustrations with the past people you paid too much money, all these things. And then suddenly by changing my state, the negotiation, what had been going on for months and months and months, has now in 3 weeks wrapped up and contract is done. And so it was a really important learning process for me to not get wrapped up into other people's paradigms, because so much of what goes on inside of a negotiation has very little to do with us and has a lot to do with people's past garbage that they're kind of pulling into the situation. And so anytime you kind of feel yourself slip into that state of competition or combativeness, I urge you to again, find this non-judgmental awareness and ask yourself, is this really about me? And if it's not, then don't take it on and just say, isn't that interesting? Like a big one inside this situation was this CEO dynamic. Okay, this is really interesting. this is obviously something they're struggling with. This is something I need to be aware of when I have conversations with them in the future, but it doesn't need to define the way that I operate inside this situation. So that was one I thought was pertinent to share. Now, the other one is preparation. And I think that this is really important because when we go into any sort of complex conversation, again, we can ask other people what their desired results are, but we need to know first and foremost what ours are. So first and foremost, I always want to identify where each side is coming from. And I'll talk about this one in the context of either a contract or trying to kind of do a salary negotiation. So, they might be coming from a place of need. There might even be a little desperation on their end in the situation because they've looked at or worked with other people or had a role open for a while and they really need your help. So really kind of grounding yourself in as to like, what is the state of each person as they enter into this conversation? Identify what is up for discussion. So define, is the value that I'm putting out there, is this fixed or is that up for negotiation? Are the elements of the contract or the job description, are those up for negotiation? But again, they're not up for debate. Our goal is not to do a match or a battle back and forth. It really is to see how can we find the common ground. And then again, having clear intentions and desired results written in advance. So this was something that really changed that kind of massive negotiation that I was talking about. Was in advance of every conversation, I would literally take 5 minutes beforehand. I would do this, really important, if you learned it on our webinar we did a couple of weeks ago, this breath pattern, which is like a 3-part inhale and a 6-part exhale. So it's like a really, really grounding breath. So I would do that for a couple minutes. And then I would, before launching the Zoom call, be like, okay, what are my intentions for this call? And I just get grounded in that. And then that would define the energy that I bring to the conversation. And so ways that we can also kind of do this prepare and practice is one, just rehearse in advance. It sounds silly, but whether it's somebody in this community or a peer you have in the industry, practice with somebody as to what you would like to say and get somebody else to play along. I've also heard a lot of women say that practicing in a mirror, particularly before like a tough negotiation or a salary negotiation, can be really, really empowering, just to watch yourself say things and to realize, does that land? Does that sound the way I want it to? Or even to record yourself kind of doing these things so that you can kind of adjust the tone of voice. And also to watch your body language too, to watch the way that you're showing up and to see, if you want to alter that manner of presenting yourself in order to kind of feel firmer in what you have to offer. Now, specific to the salary negotiation situation, because I think this is one of the biggest opportunities where women can stand tall, and the similar advice, applies to negotiating with a client, is one, going in, how much are you asking for? Are you clear in the number? A lot of people I know do what I call like a throw it over the fence kind of moment, like, they'll talk and 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 be like, and then I'd like this, okay, bye. Like we dodge. So could you lead with a number? What would it look like to say, I'm hoping to make X amount, or the value of the work that we're going to be performing looks like this, and then say, here's why. How would that change the dynamic of the conversation? The other thing you need to bring into that conversation is, why are you worth it? So do you have evidence you can offer? And one of the things that we can do here that's really, really important is, I think about it as not like a feature conversation, these are all my credentials, or, this is why I'm the best at what I do, but focusing on results, So in a hiring situation, this could be, if you're negotiating in a current role and wanting to move up in salary, talking about the results you've achieved inside the organization. I led a team, the team grew to 10 people. We were responsible for X amount of dollars. I manage a budget of this size, and making sure that those results that you're describing kind of point directly in correlation to the obligations and the role that you're up against. Or, if we're negotiating with a client, describe case studies, describe stories of other clients that are in similar in nature and how you've had successes in this area. So for example, I was in a conversation yesterday with a really, really cool organization called Plank Leadership, which are this group of all women coaches that work in the personal development and executive leadership space. And they were kind of talking about how they want to build an online community and some other elements. So as I heard those desires come through, I talked about the results we've achieved with a client who has a similar online community, who works in the same platform that they were wanting to do, and how we've developed marketing campaigns that have really benefited and grown that. So it's speaking directly to the areas that they're looking to achieve. The other thing that I think is really important is this element of how is this comparable to other industry offers. Now, this is more applicable in a job situation than it is in a client hiring situation, because as Jamie and I were describing, there can be a lot of people out there that can be charging the sun and the moon and stars and producing garbage. And so you want to, maybe avoid that comparative conversation when it comes to your work, because I think it's kind of a race to the bottom. But when it comes to a job offer, there is great industry data that you can cite. And I found that this was one of the most important skills I could teach incoming female employees, was just go out to Glassdoor, go to your market, look at other people in your industry, look at what they're being paid, because that data is going to be gender neutral. It's going to be across all of the roles, and cite that so that you can say, this is somebody comparable to my skill set in the same role in a different organization. So this is why, I expect to be compensated at this level. The other thing to focus on as well is, a lot of times when we're going into a negotiation in a business setting, the primary focus that we wrap our heads around is the money. But I think that it's important to ask ourselves, are there other items on the table besides just earnings? What is, if I'm looking to get hired, what is the package that I'm after? For me in my career, it became important at a certain point to focus more on flexibility than just on the dollars that I was earning. Or there might be things like health benefits that are more important to you than an extra $5,000, because you know what the cost would be outside of that. In a situation where we're working with a client, there might be some expectations. You might be willing to do something for less if you're meeting with the client less frequently, if the client is going to take on a portion of the project or the work. I know for us, for example, one of the things that we are a bit flexible on is time frames. So for example, if we're going to develop a website for you, we are happy, we don't really negotiate on the price on those things, but we're happy to negotiate the ability to pay for that over an extended period of time. And if you want it done like yesterday and you're going to push our team and drive us a little bit crazy to get it done faster than expected, we're going to charge a little bit extra for that, because we're going to have to say no to other work in order to prioritize your project. And so that's an important thing to just ask yourself prior to the conversation. What other areas are up for discussion, or where would I maybe be willing to flex if I could get something else instead? And then the other thing I think that's really important for us to step out of anything that feels like a scarcity mentality is asking ourselves, what is my plan B? Particularly when we're going up for a role, to ask ourselves, is this the only job available? Well, no. So remembering that somebody inside that organization needs you just as much as you need them is a really important thing to kind of ground yourself in, just so that we don't approach a negotiation from a place of scarcity. And I see this show up a lot in our business world, particularly when we're early on. I know so many women who have built an initial roster of clients that they come to really not like, because they said yes, thinking this is the only client out there. And it wasn't until their business started to grow that they started to take on clients that were paying them more of what they were worth, and they're able to shed those people. But I want to push us to start with the mentality of abundance, and that there are other opportunities out there, so that we're not, saying yes or conceding based off of a mindset of scarcity. So pausing here for a moment, any thoughts in terms of ways that you've prepared in the past going into hard conversations? And, conversations with 3-year-olds can be very difficult. I have one as well, Jamie. So.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have any examples, because this is literally the first time I'm actually negotiating the salary or for a job. So yeah, I'm happy to hear from anybody else.
Yeah. Jamie or Gina, any thoughts?
I just think, too, going back to those first points you were talking about, just the box that women have been put in really does, I mean, you're right on with those, like whether we recognize it or not, when you go in or when you're working with a client, I'm sure you've experienced this too, like all of a sudden there like gets to a point where it's like you feel like because you're a woman, they're not ready to listen, or they're not really ready, you know, there's like it could go fine, and then all of a sudden it gets at some point and you're like, wait a second, is this just because I'm a woman, you know, like, so I think those, always going back to those points is really, really, it's I'm just kind of thinking it through right now, but it's so true.
Well, and that's kind of really important qualifier for me as well. In some of these really difficult, like 6-figure negotiations over client contracts, is like, would you treat me this way if I was a man? Would I be, having this discussion if I was a man? And if the answer is no, that's actually a really important way for me to step back and say, wait a second, did I sidestep some awareness I have around the types of clients that we're looking to attract? Because my team is all women. So if you're going to have an issue with working with women, we're probably not a fit for you. And again, it might be, exciting to rush towards something that's a 6-figure contract, but unless we can ground it in a mutual area of respect, it's not going to be a good agreement and good outcome for anybody going forward.
Yeah. And I loved what you said too about the values too. Like, you can have all the money in the world, but if it's not a values fit, then it's going to be more pain than it's ever worth, for sure.
Yeah. I love that. Thank you. So these are questions that I think about. These might be some prep questions and to consider when going into conversations. One, what are my interests, or what are my values, and why is this important to me? Because again, somebody might say, well, why do you need that extra $10,000, or why is this project worth this? You want to be able to come with statements to describe, why. How is that going to feel for the people that I'm talking to, and where are the places that I see the biggest gaps between us? So again, if I know that the person going into the conversation has a budget that is quite different than what I am proposing, I need to think about how that they might respond and hold space for that, right? Where are the areas where we could find common ground? I think this one is really, really important to ask ourselves, because again, this puts us in that mindfulness state where instead of perceiving the situation as one of back and forth obstacle, we can start to see a path forward. Where do I feel firmer, and where am I willing to be flexible? So again, like what are their priorities? Am I willing to be flexible on time? Am I willing to be flexible if there are other things that I can achieve as the outcome? And then where are my lines in the sand? Where are my no-goes? Where am I like, and I'm out? And whenever I think of this phrase, lines in the sand, I think about my dad. So my dad is an attorney, and he's like a master mediator. And I think the other reason that I'm pretty decent at negotiating is because in my household growing up, you had to present your case. Like, you had to present your case for anything that you wanted to do. Sometimes it was an essay form. Like, you just had to go to bat with my dad. And my dad is the nicest man, like the sweetest man, but he has some lines in the sand. And so, for example, like, if you cross his family, if you disrespect the environment, like, these are his lines in the sand, where suddenly he might turn into a pretty different person. And usually where I find my lines in the sand come up are around my values. So for example, if I have a really strong value that we respect and reward and pay the work of women, this is a line in the sand for me. And so at one point in my career, I was in a negotiation where, prior to building out my creative team, I would do some development of marketing strategy for a client. And then I would look for an external person that we could partner with and bring them into the conversation, and obviously, like, basically gift work to them. And I was in a negotiation with a web development team, because the firm had worked with them in the past, and I said, we had a pretty good experience with them. And, could you reach out to them and see if they'd be willing to take on this project? I said, absolutely. So I give them a call. I get on a call with this guy, and he's throwing out just like wildly, like the project was like literally like a 3-page website was what we were looking to build. And his first quote was like $25,000. And I was like, I can make this in like 5 hours in Squarespace over a weekend. Like, no. And then I said, buddy, like, we're playing in pretty different ballparks. This is the number that I was thinking. And he came back and said, well, we could do that if we actually leveraged a contract designer. She's this woman who lives up in Seattle, and we'll pay her less. And then that's the way that we could meet that figure. And a line in the sand for me is, we pay women what they're worth. And his basic come back to my negotiation was, well, I can go find a woman, pay her less money, and then that's how we can achieve that budget. And so I was like, no, that doesn't work for me. Line in the sand, negotiation over. And in the end, with a little bit more looking, we found a really good woman web developer, paid her a fair price for the work, and passed it on to her. So it's just really important for us to recognize that we don't ever want to sidestep our values in a negotiation situation. So knowing what they are in advance of can be a really important defining factor as we head into those conversations. So this third piece is really, really important. And I described it a little bit in terms of the context of my large negotiation that I've been having over this number of months, but really understanding the dynamic of the conversation can dramatically shift who and how we talk. And this is more applicable when we've got multiple parties involved. But even when you're in a hiring situation, there might be the frontline person that you're talking to, but you've got to remember that there's a chain of people behind the scenes that are a part of the decision-making process. And so I like to think about who is in the room, whether that's the room that I'm sitting in when the negotiation is happening, or maybe who's in the room when they go away from that negotiation and have their little side cup discussion. Who is really in charge? So there's a dynamic sometimes that can appear in a negotiation where you think that, the leader, like the CEO or somebody like that, is the person in charge, but really there's a person over here that's actually funding the dynamic behind the decision. And then the other thing is to look for your allies. So who is in your corner? So for example, in the large scale negotiation that I've been working on, one, I uncovered who's really in charge. Well, it's somebody who's the COO, but is actually probably over time going to step into the CEO role. And the CEO is a little bit of a figurehead. And when it came to dealing with their legal team, even though it was kind of hard to deal with in some of the earlier negotiations, he hates the legal team. So he's actually in my corner in that side of the conversation. But beyond just preparing ourselves for this conversation, it's really important to just understand and observe the power dynamics at play in a non-judgmental state, so that you can recognize that if the person who you think is in charge is not actually the person calling the shots, and make a point to kind of clarify who's in the room so that you can know who to defer to or to really be doing the negotiation with at the end of the day. Another example that came to mind here was my divorce. So I went through a really icky, messy divorce early in my life. And originally, it felt like the dynamic of the divorce was between me and my ex-husband. But later on in this dynamic, he got a new girlfriend, and it started to become really clear that at the end of the day, who was calling the shots and making it hard for us to reach an agreement was not him, it was her. And she had a lot of insecurities going on, and she wouldn't even let him text me without her being on the text thread, or have a negotiation with lawyers without her being in the room. And so I started to understand that he doesn't hold the power in the situation. He's given it all away to her. So basically I had to change my negotiation strategy, because at the end of the day, she was the one who was holding the power. So again, recognizing that power dynamics might not be as they appear based off of title or circumstance, but really taking a moment to see that bigger picture. This one is the most important one. So don't allow urgency, whether that's artificial or otherwise, to shift your energy or pressure you to push towards something you don't want to do. Taking time in the negotiation process and redefining your approach is the biggest way that you can take power back in a negotiation. So one, don't let somebody else's timelines cloud your judgment. This is one of the ways that people apply pressure in a negotiation situation. We need to hear back from you by Tuesday. Okay, it's Monday. I haven't had time to consider what you're offering. I'd like to take till Thursday, and that's what's going to work for me. But this can be one of the biggest ways that we take our power back. Again, from Dr. Alvarez, she had this quote around a minute of silence can speak volumes. She was talking about difficult legal negotiations and how suddenly just sitting quietly for a minute, people are uncomfortable with silence and might start saying things that you didn't otherwise expect. And so there is a dynamic, again, that when we feel like we're in a debate, we start doing this back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. But instead, if we can silence ourselves, particularly if somebody says something off-putting or something unexpected, and just really take a moment to process, people may feel compelled to continue talking and provide information that we wouldn't have had otherwise that would change the dynamic of the negotiation. And when in doubt, like when you're in a situation that, again, creates this back and forth dynamic that's pressure based, or feeling like we got to just get to the end of this thing, take a moment to step back. If you feel yourself, all of the energy is rising up in you, you're feeling unconfident in terms of your next step forward, you feel like you're being squeezed, or like you're not going to be able to really like sit well with this decision, just say, I need to take a moment. Let's reconvene. And especially if a negotiation gets really heated, it is completely okay to say, I need to take a pause from this and reevaluate. And the other way is to, again, point to other people who might be involved in the negotiation. So if we're negotiating a salary and we have a family, there's other people who are dependent on that negotiation. If we're negotiating a business deal and we've got a team, there are other people involved in that negotiation. And so that can be one of the points that I can make. I can say, I need to really go and talk about this with my leadership team, or I need to go talk about this with my advisors, or, I need to go do some more research and see if this is going to work for us. And suddenly, the other thing that happens when we take our time back is it makes other people step forward. So for example, and I don't do this in a way to try and manipulate people, but it's just really important to me in terms of the way we negotiate new business, is I almost never, ever, ever, unless I've known the client in the past, talk anything about scope of work or pricing or anything like that on initial conversation, because it's really important for me to take a moment to do like a values check with my team and say, this is the organization that's interested in working with us. Do they feel like a fit? Do we have bandwidth? Does this project excite us? Do we think it'll lead to other clients that we like? And I need to do that. I can't do that solo on the call. And so when we do that step back, what we find is that client is that much more interested in working with us because we're not approaching it from a place of urgency. So for example, I mentioned a conversation I had yesterday with this great leadership executive coaching team. That was my response on the call, because we talked kind of in circles around different ways we could work together. And I was like, I need to go away and marinate on this. I'm going to take about a week to think. And immediately this morning, I woke up in an email from her being like, I loved our conversation yesterday. I had so much energy. I can't wait to hear back from you. But I think it really comes from that fact that I'm using time to my benefit and not trying to push something forward just for the sake of doing business. So that's a really, really important dynamic to focus on. And then the last one I just wanted to highlight is this active listening and grounding questions. So again, this is an area where I think women can really shine from a negotiation perspective, because we tend to be better listeners. And the most common misstep that people make when negotiating is thinking too much about what they're going to say next, instead of listening to what the other person is really saying. And so there's this concept that I love that's called listening in between the lines. So again, if I'm just thinking about my rebuttal, I might not be noticing the power dynamic in the conversation, or I might not be hearing, the fact that they're complaining about a past experience, and really that's where their frustrations or scarcity lie, and it has nothing to do with me and my team. And so there's a really good strategy that we can bring into play here from an active listening perspective, which is replaying back to people what you've heard. And that can also help to diffuse the situation. And I'll be clear, I use this on my husband all the time when we're having a heated argument, because it's super simple and it makes people feel heard, which then again lowers the temperature in the room. And so it's as simple as saying, what I'm hearing you say is, and then you describe what you're hearing them say, and then asking, does that feel true to you? And then that's a really validating moment where suddenly it's like, oh, you heard me. Okay. Now that doesn't mean I'm going to agree with you per se, but I am hearing you and I'm taking that into consideration. And then I can offer additional feedback. And so again, that removes this dynamic of the back and forth. This is my point. This is my point. This is my point. But nobody's being heard in this situation. And this active listening really helps us uncover those deeper understandings. So this is, what are they really telling you? My husband and I might have an argument around the fact that, a big one that came up for us recently was he chose to do an activity with our boys for over the weekend, and he was really mad that I didn't go with him. But after the conversation unpacked and I asked some of these kinds of questions, the real understanding was he felt like he missed out on quality time. And if you know my husband, quality time is like his number one love language. And so I could get into that and recognize that it actually had very little to do with the fact that I didn't go sledding with him. The other thing that you can look for when we're doing active listening is, again, that idea of listening between the lines. So there's a lot that people communicate by their tone of voice, by their body language, around the ways that they're carrying themselves. And that can inform us just as much as the words that they're saying. And that can just give us this clue to like, what are the underlying dynamics that are feeding the energy of the situation? And then based off of knowing that, we can start to kind of shift the conversation. So this is some grounding questions that I love. And one of the things that you will notice is that all of the language inside of these questions focuses on collective terminology. So again, one of the ways that we distance ourselves in a negotiation is me, you, me, you, me, you, what I want, what you want, what I want, what you want. Instead, asking open-ended questions that have inclusive terminology can really change the way that it feels in a conversation. And particularly when we're in a business dynamic, this allows for the person to actually envision the fact that we're already working together in some way. So these are my 5 favorites. How can we get creative? You know, what's a creative solution to this problem? What could we accomplish by, so in that big legal dynamic, what could be accomplished by just getting our 2 legal teams on the phone? How would that change the way things are unfolding? Would that be a good idea? What would it look like if we did X instead? The big key word here, again, is we, So instead of being like, well, I need you to pay me this much, what would it look like if we offered equity as a way to compensate for the difference in salary? Would that be something that we could be open to? How do we feel about looking at, again, insert the blank, what is the area of negotiation? Would it be possible for us to explore? So again, these are open-ended questions, that we can insert into the conversation, including this us, we type terminology that makes it feel like we're in it together rather than like we're doing battle with each other. So those are the ideas that I had to offer today. And I wanted to just close out with any additional discussions around, like, what are the hardest negotiations you've been a part of? What have you learned from past negotiations? What practices have benefited you? Or just any big takeaways from the conversation. So I'll be quiet and just see what you all wanted to share.
I'm happy to start. That was amazing. Thank you. Like I said, salary or a job is not something I've negotiated before, so this is brand new. And thank you so much for giving so many takeaways that are so pithy and so sort of easy to implement. I really love that. I also identified places where I am clearly weaker. I mentioned when you were talking about time that I'm one of those people who gets uncomfortable with silences, and so I try to fill them up with sentences. And I think it was good to realize, or I just realized that I'm that person who like volunteers information when there's like a vacuum, and I just sort of throw things out there. But thank you for saying that, because it helped me sort of understand that it's okay to be quiet and it's okay not to offer up information in negotiation, and that is actually helpful, and it doesn't have to be uncomfortable, or it doesn't have to be counterproductive. I really like that. And the other thing that also resonated with me was having a plan B. I'm in the middle of sort of trying to get out of a not very good relationship with my current boss. And so I've been applying for a lot of jobs, and I actually have a negotiation coming up next week for salaries, for benefits, for everything. The interviews went really well, so I'm guessing they really want me. And so it's strange. I've been sort of looking forward to the negotiation, but I'm also dreading it a little bit because I've never done it before. It's sort of like going on stage the first time, I guess. And, you have these butterflies and you know what you want to say, and you're kind of just hoping it comes out. It sounds right when it comes out. And so it really spoke to me when you said always have a plan B, because it helped me sort of understand and order things in my head, because I do have a lot of backup plans. being, the scientist that I am, we always have backup experiments in case the main one fails. But it's just, I didn't really think about keeping that in mind while doing the negotiation. So I always thought, you come to a negotiation, it's do or die. Like, you're there 100%, and if you don't get it, you walk away and you don't have anything to gain out of it, right? You just wasted that time. But it was really refreshing to know that that doesn't have to be the case. And I actually lined up my plan B, plan C, plan D while you were talking about it. So that really helped me. Thank you.
Awesome. I'm really glad. I'm really glad. Who else wants to share here at the end? Thank you, Shruti. Gina, curious. I'm gonna call you in. I'm curious to hear how this applies to you, particularly in terms of negotiating your value with clients. How has that changed over time? Where have you learned to feel firmer, and where are you still working on it?
I feel like, this brought up a lot. I've worked so hard on negotiating price, right? And where I feel like I've had to work even harder and have backed down more is on process. Like, I feel like I'm constantly running up against the wall on processes with clients. They seem a little bit less willing to, if they come in open-minded, but if they come in, either they've been influenced by somebody else that says, oh, that's not a good product, or this is the better way to go, then I feel like I'm fighting that more. And that's actually a little bit more frustrating than price, because I understand money is a whole nother topic for people. But if you're going to hire me, like, really value the expertise I'm bringing, and that I'm not doing, I'm doing it for your good, right? So I'm now kind of rethinking so many conversations of like, why am I fighting these clients on process? Like, if it makes my job harder and I've already, given them a really good rate, like, I got to start standing really firm. I got to draw that line in the sand of like, this is the work we do. And if you don't want to use these tools, we really can't serve you well. And I really need to sit with this for a little bit, because I'm constantly backing down in this area, and it makes my job and my team's job so much harder. So.
This is a really good one, I feel like, to share about in Slack, is like, next time you have a conversation like this come up with a client, share with the community there and ask, how would you respond to a client doing this? Because I know that there are members in our group who are very much like, this is the way we do things, take it or leave it kind of thing. And again, I look at so many other areas where it's like, if I went to my, attorney, or if I went to my dentist, or I went to any other, professional expert, I don't question, which wrench, the dentist is going to use when they're straightening my teeth. I don't question which, and part of it is because I don't know. But again, your clients don't know. And so, so really kind of recognizing there's an opportunity for you to demonstrate expertise, but also, again, like you said, it is a line in the sand, because it impacts your ability to execute properly for clients. And so maybe you need to figure out what are the statements that you would offer to be clear as to why it is that we work in this way, or we use the tools that we use. Yeah. Awesome. Well, I know we're over time, but anything else anyone wants to share before we wrap up? Fantastic.
I'm glad you recorded this.
Yeah, I will share it back for sure. And for those of you who are existing members, I'm supposed to, Sarah, who's my head of operations, was like, you need to tell everybody, we have the new member portal rolling out today. So you're going to get an email that just asks you to opt in. We changed some of our process on the back. We hope it's going to be a lot better long-term for the community. So just keep an eye out for those email notifications today. But besides that, just want to thank you all for being here, for being willing to share, and I will see you in a couple of weeks. All right.
Thank you so much, Madeline.
Bye.
Bye.